Welcome back to me. Yeah, it's good to see you guys. I've missed you all, really, immensely. You have no idea. I spend most of my days kind of working, which is kind of funny because that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. So if you got your books with you, the book, we're going to be in John chapter 4. And I'll do the same thing I always do when I'm here is I read the whole chapter, and then we're going to talk about it, and we're going to go on an adventure. So if you guys, exits are located behind me and behind you. So if you got it, you got your spot. It should be a pretty worn out chapter because everybody does 3, right? Everybody takes you to John chapter 3, and 4 comes right after 3. Right? Yeah. But before 5. Yeah, and I'm on page 1063, if you guys, if that helps anybody. English Standard Version. ESV, yeah. I'm an ESV guy. Okay. When Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard he was making and baptizing more disciples than John, though Jesus himself was not baptizing, but his disciples were, he left Judea and went again into Galilee. He had to travel through Samaria. So he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the property that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, worn out from his journey, sat down at the well. It was about noon. A woman of Samaria came to draw water. "Give me a drink," Jesus said to her, because his disciples had gone into town to buy food. "How is it that you, a Jew, ask me for a drink, a Samaritan woman?" She asked him, for Jews do not associate with Samaritans. Jesus answered, "If you knew the gift of God and who is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would ask him, and he would give you living water." "Sir," said the woman, "you don't even have a bucket, and the well is deep. So where do you get this living water? You aren't greater than our father Jacob, are you? He gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did his sons and livestock." Jesus said, "Everyone who drinks from this water will get thirsty again. But whoever drinks from the water that I will give him will never get thirsty again. In fact, the water I will give him will become a well of water, springing up from in him for eternal life." "Sir," the woman said to him, "give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and come here to draw water." "Go call your husband," he told her, "and come back here." "I don't have a husband," she answered. "You have correctly said, 'I don't have a husband,'" Jesus said. "For you've had 5 husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband. What you have said is true." So the woman replied, "I see that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews say that the place to worship is in Jerusalem." Jesus told her, "Believe me, woman, an hour is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, because salvation is from the Jews. But an hour is coming, and is now here, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. Yes, the Father wants such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth." The woman said to him, "I know that the Messiah is coming, who is called Christ. When he comes, he will explain everything to us." Jesus told her, "I am the one speaking to you, am he." Just then his disciples arrived, and they were amazed that he was talking with a woman. Yet no one said, "What do you want?" or "Why are you talking with her?" Then the woman left her water jar, went into town, and told the people, "Come, see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Messiah?" They left the town and made their way to him. In the meantime, the disciples kept urging him, "Rabbi, eat something." But he said, "I have food to eat that you do not know about." The disciples said to one another, "Could someone have brought him something to eat?" "My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work." Jesus told them, "Do not say that there are still 4 more months, and then comes the harvest. Listen what I am telling you. Open your eyes and look at the fields, because they are ready for harvest. The reaper is already receiving pay and gathering fruit for eternal life, so that the sower and reaper can rejoice together. For in this cause the saying is true, one sows and another reaps. I sent you to reap what you did not labor for. Others have labored, and you have benefited from their labor." Now many Samaritans from the town believed in him because of what the woman had said. When she testified, "He told me everything I ever did." So when the Samaritans came to him, and they asked him to stay with them, and he stayed there for 2 days, many more believed because of what he had said. And they told the woman, "We no longer believe because of what you said, since we have heard for ourselves and know that this is really the Savior of the world." After 2 days, he left there for Galilee. Jesus himself had testified that a prophet has no honor in his own country. When they entered Galilee, the Galileans welcomed him because they had seen everything he did in Jerusalem during the festival, for they also had gone to the festival. He went again to Cana of Galilee, where he had turned water into wine. There was a certain royal officer there whose son was ill at Capernaum. When this man heard that Jesus had come from Judea to Galilee, he went to him and pleaded with him to come down and heal his son. He was about to die. Jesus told him, "Unless you people see signs and wonders, will you not believe?" "Sir," the official said to him, "come down before my boy dies." "Go," Jesus told him, "your son will live." The man believed what Jesus had said to him and departed. And when he was still going, his servant met him, saying that his boy was alive. And he asked them what time he got better. "Yesterday, at 1 p.m. The fever left him," they answered. The father realized that that was the very hour at which Jesus had told him, "Your son will live." So he himself believed, along with the whole household. Now that was the second sign Jesus performed after he came from Judea to Galilee. Okay, so it's a really good story. And this is one of the stories that we pull things out of context. John is an excellent author. Anybody like the book of John? John is a really good author. He wrote his book, his gospel account, toward the end of his life, where the other authors wrote them as quickly as possible as they could, right? Like Luke wrote his in order to gather information for his friend, because he's like, in order to make a more orderly account, that's how the book of Luke opens. Every book opens with the intention of the book, what's going to happen, okay? And John does this unique teaching, the way that the Hebrews taught, the way that Jesus taught. They teach in a circular pattern, not in a linear pattern. So like if I say, if you plant a seed in the ground, it grows a plant, and then you harvest the plant and you eat it. That's a linear fashion, okay? In a circular pattern, what I would say is you plant a seed, the seed makes another seed, and then there's stuff that happens in the middle. The stuff that happens in the middle is the point of the story. And to just prove my point, if you go back to the very first book of the Bible, Genesis chapter 1, if you look, day one, there's a starting point, right? God says, "Let there be light." Nothing that precedes after that can happen unless day one happens, right? Then you have day 2. What does God do? No, that's still in day 1. He names day and he says night, right? That's what he does. He creates a separation. There's a separation that he creates in day 1. But on day 2, he separates the water above and the water below, right? Okay, Bible trivia. Okay, so I'll just go through it, okay? He separates water above, water below. And the water below he calls the seas. And the water above he calls the sky. Okay, so day 2, what do you think happens on day 4? It's easy to remember once you know the pattern and the way it works. It teaches in a circular pattern, right? Day 4, he creates the birds of the air and then the fish in the sea. So is it day 2 and day 4 directly correlate? So something happens right in the middle that I'm not going to tell you that I'm going to make it your homework. But that's how Hebrews teach, right? That's how a parable works. Did you guys know that? Ooh, I thought I taught this pretty well. Okay, a parable works by you look at what happens, the events that happen in a parable. It doesn't matter what parable it is. Anytime they tell a Jewish parable, and there's tons of Jewish parables, not just the ones that Jesus told. You guys know that, right? There's all kinds of Jewish parables, okay? So what you do in order to get the point of the parable, it's like an arrow. That's why, in the Psalms, it talks about God has many arrows in his quiver, right? Because the point of knowledge is to get the point. And you won't understand it if you're thinking like a Greek. So what you do in order to understand a parable is you look at the two things that are on the ends, and then you go to the middle. What is it in the middle? And that's what makes the point. That's as simply as I can put it. So next time you go read a parable, or you go look at a psalm, or you go look at anything, look at the two things that are on either end. Something happened in the middle that you weren't paying attention to. Because the poorest people are the ones who don't pay attention, right? And the level at which you pay attention determines the amount of wisdom that you're going to gain from whatever it is that you're looking at, okay? So now that I've said that, and I've kind of tried to give a broad overview of how to understand parables, I say this all the time, but I'm just going to give a refresher. Knowledge is just the facts. Understanding is why the facts matter. And wisdom is applying those things in your life. Okay? Everybody got that? Knowledge is just the facts. So what I just read you is what? The facts. Now why? Why does this story matter? That's what we're going to get into next. Okay? This is kind of the long part. So where this story, I jumped into John. I jumped into the book of John, and I jumped 4 chapters in. There's all kinds of stuff that happened before this, right? So I'm going to give a quick overview of what happened before this. John in chapter 1, what does he do? He retells the Genesis story. And then he mirrors that first story with John the Baptist. John the Baptist is baptizing, okay? So he mirrors the first story. If you were to take it and look at it, you could fold the 2 pages on top of one another, and they reflect each other, okay? When he talks about in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. And then he starts the next sequence in the second half of that chapter, and he talks about John the Baptist. John the Baptist was preaching in the wilderness, and the people came to him to listen, and he was baptizing people in water. Come on, guys. It's awesome, isn't it? It's a painting. He's painting with words. Because one part of the chapter reflects the next part of the chapter. And then when you really start thinking about that, the way John wrote this whole book, and you look at the very first chapter, and you look at the very last chapter in the book of John, guess what? It makes a nice, neat picture. It's a beautiful story. And we did it in men's Bible study. And it is awesome. It's an awesome book when you really start to understand what John is trying to get at. Because he makes the same point over and over again in the story. Some people will look at this book, and I don't know if they don't see it, or if they're just not looking at the ends and finding the sharp point in the middle. But they look at the book, and they make it all about miracles, right? They think that the book is all about miracles. Because in each chapter, John does what? He points out something that Jesus did that's something that we don't see every day. But guess what else we don't see every day? You're talking about the mirrors, right? What else we don't see every day is our Lord and Savior, right? Unless we're really looking in the middle, okay? So that's what, a lot of us are often looking for miracles. So if you were to take this chapter of the book, and I'm going to try to give you the understanding part now. I know I'm long-winded. So, like I told you guys, the exits are in the back, right? So I take a long time to get to where I'm going because I want to get everybody together, okay? So if you were to take this book and fold it, or this chapter of the book and fold it right in half, Does anyone want to guess what would be the point right in the middle of this narrative? Well, it kind of ends where Jesus says, well, it's a phrase, all right? It's a puzzle. It's a puzzle, but it's not something that's hidden. It's not a hidden puzzle. It's right there in front of your face. When Jesus is talking to the Samaritan woman, he says something really interesting to her that I hear people say all the time. He says something to her that I think as modern thinkers don't really understand, but we repeat it over and over again in the hopes that we can get it. Because Jesus says something about the true worshipers of God will worship in what? Okay, see, you guys have heard it over and over again. So good, okay, I don't have to teach anymore, right? Because you guys all understand exactly what that means, right? No, we don't, do we? It took a lot of study for me to get to that point to understand why he said the things that he did to the person he did in the place that he did. Now, if you look at any book in the Bible, there's a set of books that are called the wisdom literature. You guys familiar with the wisdom literature? What would that be? Somebody throw out the first one. Psalms is not. That's praise literature, yeah. It's close. Good guess. Ecclesiastes, good. I taught that entire book, right? Ecclesiastes, one of my favorite books. Ecclesiastes, there's 3 that are accepted commonly. Proverbs. Somebody said Proverbs. Who was that? Point. You get a point. I'm going to make this a competition, okay? Proverbs. And then there's another one about an old guy who just, man, his life gets terrible. He just gets down and his friends show up and Job, good. There's 2 points. You guys get to go home with 2 points. Okay, I know you guys know that. I'm just trying to wake everybody up because we're going to do the praise, right? So, all right. So you guys are with me. There's 3 accepted books of wisdom. I argue that there's a 4th book. But when you look at those books and you sit and you read through them, I don't know how much time you guys spent reading through Ecclesiastes or Job, because are they the hopeful books that you're like, oh, there's the light at the end of the tunnel kind of books? No, they're about our real experience as humans, right? So when you read through those books, any one of those books, what's really interesting, and a lot of people don't notice this because they're not looking at the edges first to get the point in the middle, right, is the book starts out as a conversation. Do you guys know that? All 3 of those books start as a conversation, right? How does Proverbs start? Listen, my sons. Listen to Lady Wisdom and the things that she has. Who's he talking to? He's talking to you? Well, we all want to interpret it that he's talking to me, but he's having a conversation, isn't he? He's having a conversation with his sons, and he turns his sons over to Lady Wisdom, who's regarded as God giving his wisdom to the people, to his children, right? It's conversation. The whole book of Proverbs is a conversation. Hey, you know what you shouldn't do? You shouldn't do this. You know why? Because this is the thing that will happen. That's the book of Proverbs. You shouldn't do this. Don't chase after that woman. A good wife, who can find one? Right? It's a conversation. Like, we don't realize that. Because we've rolled it out, we've made it flat. But it's a conversation. And every book of wisdom literature always starts with a conversation. Point number 2, Ecclesiastes, the second book of wisdom. How does it start? It's grandpa talking to his grandsons. And he says, listen, guys, there was this preacher that I knew a long time ago. Listen to the things that he had to say. And then grandpa starts quoting what the preacher had to say to his grandsons. And the whole time, it's actually grandpa talking to his grandsons. You realize that's the context in which that literature is written, as a conversation. Right? So, the third book of wisdom, Job, how does it start? Well, there was this guy. A long time ago, he lived in the land of Uz. And then God was gathering together all of his people. And God has a conversation, doesn't he? God's having a conversation with the adversary. And inside of that conversation that God and the adversary have, all the events that transpired to Job happen. Right? Like, here's the narrative, and where it starts is the conversation. And then all this stuff over here is what they're talking about. That's how every book of wisdom literature works. That's how you divide those things. Now, there is a fourth book that I'm not going to give you. That's more homework for you guys. There's a fourth book of wisdom literature. And it's about Solomon, and he's having a conversation with his soon-to-be bride. Yeah. Well, I mean, come on. Every book of wisdom is attributed to what writer? Okay, so how does a man supposed to pursue wisdom? How did you pursue your wife? You get it? Because that's what the Song of Songs is about. It's the two ends and what you're really going after. Because Solomon may have had a lot of concubines, right? A lot of wives. But what was it that Solomon desired more than anything else? So what is it that he pursued? So what's Song of Songs about? Pursuit of wisdom. Okay, so if you read through any ancient poetry, I mean, it is kind of racy. You guys, how much time do you guys spend in Song of Songs? Right, like it'll make you blush on some spots, won't it? Yeah, it'll make you blush in some spots, but that's how you were, wasn't it? When you first fell in love, that's what you did. All those things. And why is it that we get comfortable in where we are and we stop pursuing? We're like, I know enough. There was a famous quote, and I don't know who quoted it, so I'll apologize for not giving the original author their due. But they said, I'm too old to know everything, right? But I think sometimes the opposite is true, too, is because we think that we've experienced so much in life is that we think we know it all. But we don't, because there's new stuff to learn all the time, is there not? It's just we've become poor, mentally poor, as we get older, and we stop paying attention. Okay, so in the middle of the story, let's come back to it. Let's reel it back in, right? Let's reel it back in, because I got a bunch of thought bubbles going at the same time up here. So when we go back to the story, in John chapter 2, there's a wedding that happens. And then it's mirrored by something else. And you guys can go back and look at that and be like, wow, maybe that guy was right about something. Maybe there's some wisdom to be found here. John chapter 3, a priest comes up, right? And he's like, as the priest approach, he's like, hey, great teacher. And Jesus just like kind of passes him off, doesn't acknowledge him. And then Jesus starts proclaiming things that don't make any sense to Nicodemus. And Nicodemus is like, these things don't make sense to me. That's just me summing up chapter 3. There's a lot that happens there too, but for sake of time, we're going to move to chapter 4. So he's had this confrontation. John has declared who Jesus is from the beginning. John declares it right after John the Baptist declares it right after John of Patmos declares it, right? Then you have a wedding, which is a traditional event that happens. And then it's mirrored by something else. And I'm not giving you that. That's not going to be free bonus material. And then you have this woman who's nobody. And there's some interesting points to pull out of this. Very interesting, because when he tells her, believe me, woman, in verse 21, he says, believe me, woman, an hour is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know. So, okay. So, in Jesus, okay, so here's the awesome thing about Jesus, is he acts just like his dad, doesn't he? Because what has he done with two categories of people? He's divided them into two categories, right? But you'll notice that he's doing something almost really interesting. We know salvation, you don't know it. The true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. So he's saying, here's the edges. You call yourself a Samaritan, and you call me a Jew. Now, as a Jew, I know what I'm doing, and you have no idea. Okay? I'm just paraphrasing, okay? So there's your edges. There's your edges. Now Jesus says the true worshipers, well, where are they at? Because the hour's coming, or is it here? Because that's kind of the way he phrases it. Because how does she respond to the things that he has to say? Well, with questions, doesn't she? Even when she goes into town, do you guys see all the question marks? You have question marks everywhere in this chapter. They're all over the place. And if you don't, they should be. Because where do I get this water? Woman, if you knew who I was, that's a question. Right? When he says that, everything is labeled with a question. So every time she makes a statement, she's kind of trying to close the door of the conversation. When she says, oh, you don't have a bucket, how are you going to get the water out? Okay, she made a statement, you don't have a bucket, but then she said, how are you going to get the water out? And Jesus, what does he do? He doesn't even respond to that, does he? He's like, if you knew who I was, you'd ask me for water. And that's good. That's really good. Because despite however much she tries to close that door on the conversation, he keeps kicking the door open, right? And making her ask more questions. And why is he doing that? Well, because there's a point to be made for all of us. And John tells this story beautifully. Because the centerpiece is right here. The true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. Yes, the Father wants such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. Now, ancient Hebrew understanding of the word spirit is ruach. Ruach. That's the Hebrew word for spirit. So when you look and God's spirit hovered over the deep, it was God's ruach. Okay? It's Elohim ruach. That's the Hebrew translation. Now, if you want to know what spirit actually means, put your hand over your face and say, ruach. And you can feel it. Okay? Ruach. You guys can do it. It's all right. I'm not up here to judge anybody. You can feel it. It comes in when you say ruach, the wind on your hand comes in 3 distinct hits. Ruach. It comes right in 3 hits, okay? So he wrote it into the beginning. He knows what he's doing, okay? So, spirit, she understands that. Truth, that one is obscure even to us today, isn't it? What was it that Pilate asked Jesus when Jesus said, I am the truth? What does Pilate say? What is it? And did you answer that question? He's standing right in front of him, yeah. But plain as day, right? But where are we at? Right? Is he plain as day right in front of us? Well, he's given us hints and examples on how and what it is. So I went through spirit, okay? But worship. Okay, I can't believe I'm going to teach about worship in a Pentecostal assembly. Okay, worship, okay. How many of you think that worship, just by show of hands, no judgment. I'm not here to judge anybody, okay? That's God's job, okay? And we must, let me put it this way. Humility is when you make the things you don't know more important than the things that you do know. So be brave. How many of you think you have a firm grasp on what it is to worship? Firm grasp and understanding. Okay, cool. So I can teach on that. All right, you guys with me? All right, good. Nobody raised their hand. I'm not going to raise my hand all the way, but I'll give you half of it, okay? Hebrew understanding, shemek, is the Hebrew word for what it means to worship. Now, shemek also means if I was to take this bottle and push it down to the ground. Okay, here's a living example right here, okay? Can you guys see the bottle? It just got shemecked, okay? It got knocked over. It's prostrate. It's laying on the floor. That's literally what the word means, okay? Physically, literally what it means. Now, okay, does anyone want to guess the first, if you want to understand a word in the Bible, the first thing you do is to go to the first place that it shows up, right? You find in the edges so that you can get to the understanding, okay? And I'm going to do this triangle shape all day, I think, but I'm going to end up doing this, talking with my hands like my dad back there. So does anyone want to guess the first place that worship appears? Just take a stab. Face down, on the ground, prostrate. First place that it happens. Genesis chapter 18. All right, I'll give you guys that one, okay? Genesis chapter 18. Who knows what happens in Genesis chapter 18? I'm just going to touch on the story. It's a really interesting story. So Genesis 1 through 5 is pretty much our history, right? Like stuff that happened way back then, way back then. And then in chapter 6, you're introduced to a new character. Who's this character? He's named Abram. And Abram, he lives in his father's basement. Basement. And Abram's an old man, and he lives in his father's basement. I'm just going to fly over this as quickly as I possibly can, because I thought I love Genesis 18. So Abram's living in his father's basement, and God says, Abram, come out. Leave your father's house. Come to this place that I'm going to show you. And Abram's like, I ain't doing anything else, so let's go. Right? Let's go on a trip. And Abram's in his 70s probably at that point. So Abram and Sarah, his sister-in-law, they go on this trip, and they go through all these troubles. They meet these kings, and Abram is he's got a yellow belly, and he's like, no, this is my sister. It's not a lie, but it's, right, she's my wife too, but he does all this stuff happens. And then you got all these chapters of just, he has to rescue his nephew. There's some crazy stuff that happens. Some kings want to kill him. They're hunting him down. He's living the life, right? Living the dream. Not really. Abram's suffering, and he's going through this parched and perilous place, and the only reason he knows up to this, well, it happens before this point. The only reason he knows to do it is because this guy came to him and told him. And he's starting to doubt himself, and he's starting to doubt the journey that he's on. So we fast forward to Genesis chapter 18, and he's like, 3 chapters ago, God, you promised me that I would have offspring, and I still haven't seen it, right? 3 chapters in Abram's life is a long period of time, okay? So Abram is like, he's hoping. God's given him this promise already that his descendants will be as numerous as the stars. Sarah's starting to lose her posterity. And she comes up with this idea, and Abram is like, okay, sure. But in Genesis chapter 18, it opens up, and Abram saw these 3 men. He looked up, and there's these 3 guys standing on top of a hill. And Abram was like, oh no. He runs out of his tent. He runs up to the top of the hill, and he bows down before these 3 men. These 3 men aren't introduced until halfway through the chapter. That's who they really are. But Abram, he sees these guys, and he recognizes something that we don't. Authors do it all the time. They'll tell you the story, and they'll be like, oh yeah, that guy back there, and that part was that guy, right? This guy was that guy. And it gets kind of confusing. But these 3 men who are on top of the hill, Abram's like, Sarah, make some bread. And she ends up making 6 pounds of flour. And I don't know if you guys know how much flour that is, but how much bread that makes. But that's enough to feed an army, a small army. I think the math on it's like 780 people. Enough bread for 700 people or something like that. Or 4,000. I can't remember. I did the math on it. It's pretty close. It parallels the Jesus story of the feeding of 5,000, 4,000. Yeah, it parallels it. So Abram, he gets the fatted calf. Here's these guys that show up. And all you know at this point in the story is the 3 guys show up, and Abraham's acting really strange. And these 3 guys show up, and they're like, hey, Sarah's in the tent making the bread. And then she hears a voice. And the Lord spoke to Sarah, and he said, this time next year, you're going to have a child. And she giggled. So her child's name was Giggle. And guess what happened a year later? Well, Abram had 2 heirs, right? Because he made such a good decision. But those 3 men decided to take Abram with them, right? There's a conversation that happens in that story between the 3 men, and they're like, should we show them what we're about to do? I don't know. Yeah, let's take Abram. It's funny. It's funny when you look at it through the context. So when the storytellers tell the story, you got Abram is being dragged along with these 3 men, and God shows up because he just so happened to be one of the 3 guys, right? And God tells him, he says, you know what, the city is going to be destroyed. And guess who's in that city? Abram's nephew. So what does Abram do? He starts pleading with God, and he's like, hey, listen, would you save the city for 20 righteous men? Sure. And Abram's like, well, finding 20 is going to be a little rough in that town. How about 10? How about 5? And then guess what? They couldn't even find 5 guys because he sent the 2 helpers down to go try to find 5 guys, and the only one they could find was Abram's nephew. And it doesn't even say that he was righteous. They just went down to get him because, Abram was God's friend. He was his friend. That's how God describes Abram. After all the stuff that Abram put him through, God still describes him as his friend. So anyway, that's the first place that it shows up. Abram worshiped these 3 guys who were on top of a hill. He didn't praise them, he worshiped them. And there is a distinct difference between praise and worship. See, because praise is when you take someone and you elevate their status, right? Like if I was to if someone was to pat me on the head afterwards, and it's going to happen inevitably, but somebody's going to give the POB, right, pat on the back, and they're going to say, hey, good job. You did great. What are they doing? They're lifting me up, right? They're lifting me up. Okay, so they're praising me. We're lifting up that person. That's praise. Now, worship involves you realizing that you're not going to move that person's status. That person's status is regardless of where you are. So the only thing that you can do is lower your own. See how that works? In the modern context, the way that looks is something along the lines of, I'm not the guy who made these rules. And the guy who made these rules is way better than me. So you should ask him. That's a modern context of worship. Because what am I doing? Self. I'm lowering myself. I'm not changing. Let's just use Jesus as the example, right? Jesus is the example. And I'm going to say, look, this guy he's the greatest guy ever, right? He did all these things. He is better than any other man that's ever lived on the earth. What am I doing there? I'm praising. Good. Who said that? That came from the middle, I think. That was good. That was really good. Okay, so now we can identify what praise is. Okay, now if I was to say, now, Jesus did these things, and because he did these things, my status has been raised because of who he is. I am valuable because of what he did for me. What am I doing then? Because I'm not changing his status at all, am I? I'm not moving him up a social scale. I'm not making him any higher than he is, or I'm not bringing him any lower. But I'm accepting that my own status in society is 0 without him. That's worship. Okay? It's the same act as if I was to get on my face in front of you. I would be worshiping you because, quite literally, and this is easier to teach to people who are from Eastern cultures. We're from a Western culture where we say you never bend a knee to a man or anything like that. But in their culture, if a king shows up, guess what? You're bowing on your face. So this is the lesson. Now this woman, now let's go back. Okay, we found the edges of what praise and worship is and what wisdom is. And I'm running out of time. Okay. Let me stretch this out here. So, okay, yeah, I know, but there's a lot of ground to cover because I've barely even hit the middle of the story. So, here's this woman. Okay, let's go back to the story, and I'm going to paraphrase. Here's this woman, and I'm going to find the edges, and we're going to go back to the middle. So here's this woman who is what? What's her social status? You're a Samaritan woman getting water in the middle of the day, and you've been married 5 times in a society that's completely monogamous. What's your social status? Right. 0. I like it. It's not 1 less than 0, because it can't be. And it's not 1 more than 0, because it can't be, unless someone else shows up. Right? So now here's this woman who has almost no value whatsoever, and Jesus does what? He knows she's coming. What's he doing? God, let's change it from Jesus to God himself shows up to this well. Because that's the period that John puts on this. Because you know why? The story of Jacob's well. God told him to dig that well there. because that's the place where Jacob saw the ladder of the angels coming down and up from heaven. So that's where he dug the well. Why do you think the Samaritans worship there? Because God himself showed up there. Jacob, take off your shoes. You're on holy ground. The place you fell asleep on that rock. There he built a temple, right? Okay? When he came back through, after all that time he spent, when he came back through, guess what he did? He remembered the place where he laid his head and where God spoke to him. And you know what he did in remembrance? He built a temple, is what it says. But what they're saying is that temple, what was left of it, is it's a well. That's what's left of this place. So where God met man at the beginning of the tribe of Israel is the place where God seeks to meet woman. That's good, right? Well, you really think about it. God himself showed up here, did he not? Anybody believe God and Jesus, Father and Son, are one, right? Okay. Anybody with me on that one? Good. Okay, I hope I'm waking people up. So here's God himself, and he shows up, and what does he do? What's he doing? Is he proactively pursuing this woman? No, he's waiting. He's waiting at this well. Now, Abram, all the time he spent wandering through the desert, what do you think God was doing? He's waiting. Because God is patient, right? Slow to anger. He's a good God. And what character traits is Jesus showing here as he waits in the noonday sun? You know, it's said that only donkeys and gringos walk in the noonday sun. But apparently Samaritan women who have had 5 husbands and messiahs also walk in the noonday sun. Jesus is just taking a break, right? You could take it that way, or he's waiting for her. And the way that she responds to him. Because if you think about the chapter before it, how does Nicodemus respond to Jesus? Oh, great teacher. What does one have to do? He's asking all the right questions, but he's got the wrong status, doesn't he? Because you can almost see Nicodemus standing there, standing tall, like how does Nicodemus approach? Okay, let me put it this way. How does Nicodemus approach? Is he saying, your status is your status? Or is he saying, oh, great teacher? Is he praising or worshiping when he approaches? He's praising him because he's trying to elevate his status. That means that Nicodemus is acknowledging in the back of his mind, in his subconscious somewhere, he's acknowledging that Jesus, everyone else sees him as nobody. So what he's going to do to try to get brownie points is he's going to pick him up, say, okay, well, let's see what this guy's really about. Because the moment you start to praise somebody, what do? Like it's a terrible example. It's a terrible example. But if you were to walk up to Donald Trump and say, you are the greatest president ever in U.S. history, do you think he'd be like, oh no, I shouldn't take that comment? I mean, do you think that that's the way that... I mean, it's arbitrary example, but we all do it, don't we? Because if I was to walk up to you and say, oh, that is the most beautiful dress I've ever seen. Right? Right? We compliment people in order to what? So we can get past their social defenses. That's what we do. You come up to somebody and say, oh man, you smell good today. Where'd you get that? That is a nice suit you're wearing. What are those people doing? Praising you, lifting you up. Now, some people have the best intentions of lifting other people up. That's one of the spiritual gifts, right? Some people have the best intentions. But some people don't have such good intentions. And Jesus probably already knew Nicodemus' intentions. So how he responds to Nicodemus is kind of like, shut it down. He shuts it down because he doesn't even acknowledge it. If you notice, when he's talking to Nicodemus, Nicodemus says, oh, great teacher, what must one do? And Jesus is like, you got to be born again. And Nicodemus responds with, oh, this is foolishness, kind of, doesn't he? He's like, oh, well, what am I supposed to do? Crawl back up inside of my mom? And Jesus is like, nope. Just shuts him down. Just completely shuts the conversation down. Right? With this woman at the well, he does the exact opposite approach. He takes the exact opposite approach. God is awesome. He does what he pleases in the heavens, Psalm 115. But the beautiful part of this is here's this woman, and in John's gospel, You know who the only person in John's gospel to reveal Jesus as Messiah is? Do you guys know? John the Baptist doesn't do it in John's gospel. Remember, he's telling the story inside of this story. The Samaritan woman is the only one who Jesus reveals his true identity to. She is the only one inside of that story. It's interesting, isn't it? Because if you take the first half of John's gospel and you fold it in half, this is the story that's right in the middle. Because who is it that God picks? To make the wise foolish and the strong weak. The people we never expect. Right, so moving on. So there's this woman, and when she approaches, her approach is slightly different than Nicodemus's, because how does she approach? She's just like, I'm just going to do my thing. I'm going to get my water, and she doesn't even initiate the conversation, if you notice. She doesn't open the conversation at all, does she? Who's the one who opens the conversation? God himself. God himself is the one who opens the conversation. And how does she come to him? She doesn't. She comes to the well where he's waiting. Well, that's a deep subject, right? That's a funny little play on words. Still trying to wake everybody up. I'm trying to wake up myself. And then, okay, so who drinks from this well? Who drinks from this well? Samaritans do. Why are you, a Jew, asking me, a Samaritan? Right? Like, you're greater than me. Why would you ask me for something? What's she doing? No, she's not raising his status. He's a Jew. What's she doing? She's worshiping. Because where's her status? She knows where it is. Right? Like, do I have to do the water bottle thing again? Shemek. Okay? What's she doing? What's she doing when she says that? She says, you're a Jew. We shouldn't even be talking because you're better than I am. Jesus' status is still the same. He's a Jew because how does he address her for the rest of the conversation? Until he ends the conversation and makes her into something more than a Samaritan. Because she's the first evangelist, right? John just paved the way. This woman, this no-named woman in the middle of the Samaritan desert on top of a hill in the middle of nowhere is the first evangelist. Because she goes and tells everybody the Messiah's coming. She goes to town and she says that. And then the people in the town, what do? Well, that's the part that's really interesting. Because how do the people in the town respond to the woman? At first, they all started to believe. They're like, oh, wow, he told you everything about yourself? He knew? Well, she responded with truth, didn't she? Because how is she worshiping? She's like, Jesus is here. You're a Jew. You're here. You're better than I am. And then her next response to him is what? Truth. Because how does she respond with what he says to her? Go get your husband. She's living out the principle that he lays out after it before he gives it to her. She's living it before he gives it to her. Because you know why he told her those things? So that we could hear them today. Because we forget. We think that it's all about praise, but sometimes we forget who we are. Amen? So here's the woman. She's nobody. She acknowledges that she's nobody. She tells him the truth. And then Jesus tells her, the real worshipers of God, those who truly humble themselves before the Lord, are the ones who are willing to speak to truth of who they are and where their status is. And that by no means am I saying that I'm any better than anyone else in this room, but that's the point. Because we forget, we conflate praise and worship, and we miss the point of this story because we've done so. Amen? We forget what it is because both are essential. Because God's seeking after people who? These worshipers. He's seeking after these people. The people who are honest enough to say, you know what? I messed up. I know who I am. We mess up a lot. I mean, if I was to get a whiteboard out here and start putting dots on it for all the mistakes I made even before I put on these boots, right? It wouldn't be a whiteboard for very long because that's who I am. And we all should accept that and admit it. Because that's truly what moves us closer to God. It's Him waiting for us to get to that point. You see? He's waiting for us there. And we're too busy walking around trying to establish more status with another husband, a new car, a this or a that. And we're trying to be socially accepted by the people around us that we forget that the right place to be is where we know that we already are. Because that's where He's waiting for us. So to worship it is in a physical sense, to put yourself against the ground. But in the social context, because we got both here, the examples are all over right there. The social construct is to accept where you truly are. It's not putting on a crown and going and seeing the king. It's not putting on your finest clothes and going to see the king. It's putting on your work boots. And realizing who you are. And that realization is the place where you meet God. Because He comes to us as we are, not where we need to be. Amen? So if you look at the end of this, right, it's always kind of thrown me off. And that's why I couldn't ever get out of this chapter. Is that when the people in the town, okay, so this is the people in the town. And this is a really interesting part of this story. And I'll close with this, because I know you guys are probably tired of listening to me talk about this Samaritan woman. But she's not the poor one, okay? Because the poorest person is the one who never pays attention. So the people in the town, Jesus sends her. He knows what she's going to do. And the disciples, He loves the disciples, right? He loves the disciples at this point. And they're like, we have no idea what's going on. He was talking to a woman. I think she was a Samaritan. But none of them ever articulate anything that they're saying to Jesus. That's in the story. None of them ever say it. Somebody must have brought him food. And then Jesus overhears one of them saying it. And He's like, no, you guys are dense. Because I've already got food. You don't see it because you're too busy looking at the fields, trying to judge what season it is. But I tell you what, it's time. People are already getting paid to do the job. And you guys are standing around worried about food. Right? The fields are full of it. And they're still just confounded, like, I have no idea what He's talking about. And Jesus, slow to anger, definitely. He's got that character trait down in here, okay? Especially in this story. So the people in the town, this is the one that always threw me off. And I think I've got just a couple more minutes, if you guys bear with me, just a little bit. You guys still with me? All right, good. So the people in the town, okay, so here's this woman. She's had 5 husbands. She's the outcast of the town. She comes into town and she says, there's this guy, Jesus. I just met him. I dropped my buckets and came up here because He is the Messiah and He told me so. He's coming. The Messiah is coming. And they're like, okay, we believe, right? And many believed, right? And many believed. And then Jesus shows up into town and He stays there for 2 days. And they're like, then they go to the woman and they say to her, they say, you know what? We don't believe because of what you said. We believe because He came here to us. And I think a lot of us struggle with that because we think that we're all going for that pat on the back, right? That POB that I talked about earlier. We're hunting for that pat on the back. We want, the master to say good things about us and the things that we've done in our lives. And that's good. It's good. But we often forget, no matter how much we evangelize or we do the things that we do, it's not about raising our status at all. Because our status will always be the same. It's where He put us. It's about Him. It's about more people being visible to Him. And that's why John says what he says. I must decrease in order for Him to increase. Because when we do that, we miss the story completely. Because that's what Nicodemus was looking for. He was looking for retribution. He was looking for the guy who was going to make him the next best rabbi. And what was the Samaritan looking for? The Samaritan woman was looking for a drink. And what did she find? What did Nicodemus find is a better question, because it wasn't very much. So on with that, and I'll end with a word of prayer. And then we'll fellowship, right? Yay! And we'll come to this time of praise, maybe awake. I hope I woke most of you up. I hope I shocked you into awakeness.